Try.
I think we talked about sectarianism. I forgot the other ones. I had it in my notes, but I deleted them. Oh well. We'll start off. Hey, thank you for giving me that information. Contingencies. All right, I'm going to look up the word contingency. Hold on. All right. So we got contingency. Let's see here. Where's it at? There it is. Sticker. No, not stickers. What am I doing? It's effects. So contingency, a future event or circumstances which is possible but cannot be predicted with certainty. So that's contingency. I'll accept refugees, and that's about it. All right, let's go. If it is unfashionable to return to the concept of necessity as the basis for human emancipation, it is because the theoretical traditions that forbade this concept and instead of demanded that we speak only of contingency is still prevalent. This tradition, however, is prevalent primarily at the heart of first world academia and was little to do with the world as seen from below. When placed in contact with the global masses, the wretched of the earth, such as theoretical traditions might be meaningless, though it is indeed meaningful in the context of these treaties, because we have been discussing from the onset the problem of these new manifestos with their endless talk of horizons and hypotheses. Manifestos embedded in first world academia. This embeddedness means that regardless of any attempt to reclaim the totalizing narrative of communism, we are still forced to deal with all those theoretical critiques that forbade us from speaking of the necessity of communism. For to speak of necessity is to deny the claim that history might be nothing more than a contingent moments incapable of telling us anything insignificant, and that to demand necessity from this claim of contingency might be tantamount to totalitarianism. In Nietzsche's Genealogy of History, Michael Foucault argued that history should be seen as nothing more than a percussion of contingencies, where no moment precedes the necessary demand for another, and every historical development must be recognized as murderous. To speak of necessity of revolution is in this context, it is also to speak to the totalizing discourse, another game of power and knowledge that is no more or less valuable than the past and future avalanches of murders which amount to history. Beyond the eternal manifestations of power knowledge, then there is no such thing as historical development. To imagine progress, even in the qualified sense of successive modes of production, is to subordinate the contingent and ultimately unchanged reality of history in the totalizing narrative. Such an understanding of history can only treat revolutionary movements as further examples of murderous totalization. And a revolution is no better than what it is revolting against. Ultimately contingent, it claims regarding necessity little more than excuses for the exercises and mobilization of power. According to this interpretation, then, the moment of revolution is simply another meaningless cipher in the swamp of contingent expressions of power knowledge. The Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsarist regime, providing justification for this revolt. But this is only the point at which one discourse supersedes another. We are told that we cannot assume this event has anything to do with the necessity to sweep the Tsarist regime from the historical stage. Rather, necessities are imagined after the event, imposed on the chain of contingencies, and are able to masquerade as progressive simply because there has been a violent occupation of the historical stage. The Bolsheviks can invent historical necessities and convince their revolutionary adherents to accept their interpretation simply because they have successfully replaced one discourse with another. Quote, an event, Foucault tells us, quote, is not a decision, a treaty, a reign, or a battle, but a reversal or a relationship of forces. The usurpation of power, the appropriation of a vocabulary turned against those who had once used it. Hence, we discover the emergence of an analysis that can speak only of contingencies. Here is a demand to treat history as a series of particular ruptures, connected only to the development of power, that rejects a prior all talk of continuity and universality. Due to the almost neurotic desire to avoid totalization, this demand has done, though often and unintentionally, great damage to history. This rejection of totalization, however, and the replacement of necessity with contingency was a logical response to the excesses of revisionism and crude historical materialism. The postmodern current in thought that alone with capitalism sought to banish communism to be neither a theory, netherworld of theory, communism to the netherworld of theory, cannot be simply dismissed as a petty bourgeois phenomenon, though it most certainly amounts to a petty bourgeois ideology. In some ways, such a position was also a theoretical rejoinder to the equal petty bourgeoisie deformation of communism that by the time China's revolution was reversed was briefly hegemonic. Here was a communism that tended to understand social reality according to the crudest comprehension of social class, an understanding that might have caused even Marx to shudder, that excluded other oppressed social positions and argued that ideologies such as feminism or anti-racism, queer radicalism, etc., were little more than petty bourgeois politics that had nothing to do with serious business of class struggle. Partially in response to this crude, hold on a second, I did something. My bad. All right. Hello, Spencer. You're still here. Partially in response to this crude existentialism, which was a dogmatic desire to appear to a pure Marxism, as if it was ever pure. The radical proponents of this new theoretical fad would champion the ideal of disunified identity-based struggles because sometimes influenced by their own experience. The most popular communist understanding of necessity at that time seemed incapable of pulling these other concerns into its orbit. The other concerns being going back to feminism, anti-racism, and queer radicalism, those type of things. That's the orbits. In many ways, this practice was the penalty of the sin of dogmatic and chauvinist communism. And it was worth recognizing this fact and using it as an occasion for reflection. In other words, we need to admit that it was a necessity to take these other concerns into account. Do you understand how they possibly determine social class rather than dismissing them as entirely contingent? At the same time, however, the politics produced due to the rejections of a totalizing necessity was a politics that could lead nowhere. Sites of identity-based struggles could only produce a praxis incapable of solidarity. Theories of intersectionality, quote unquote, were most often banal, merely in recognition of the fact that multiple moments of oppression and exploitation included base class intersects. Simply noting that the possibilities of intersection, though it is not an analysis, it is an ineffectual truism. These theories were thus incapable of explaining the meaning of these intersections. After all, to provide this meaning would be an act of totalization. Affinity groups, safe spaces, broader wars in the names of various categories of oppression. A general theoretical chaos that could produce little more than confusion that amounted to a political limbo. Thus, necessity gangs rears its unpopular head, and those who would reject its logic would be entirely uncomfortable with the claim that their praxis of contingency produces also its own necessity. For here, at a point where totalization is rejected as murderous and vulgarization of contingency must become entirely necessary. If we examine the practice of these politics, we are forced to conclude that these politics necessarily lead to the limited practice of social reformism. For what else can identify politics which has no political content beyond valorizing sites of oppression as radical identities produce? Not the solidarity and organization that world historical revolutions have taught us are necessary for revolution. Indeed, reformist practice is precisely the concrete result of this typical politics. Its most vocal proponent, if they are active at all, are generally active primarily in struggle for social reform. The hope behind this activity, though, was the hope of movementism. The multiple sites of struggle would become more than a sum of the reformist parts, that the avalanche of multiplicity would produce a radical movement capable of eclipsing the simple unity of past practices. So they're saying we need to take these all in consideration, that there is intersectionality. All right, 2. Oh, request canceled. This practice combining contingency with multiplicity is probably best expressed in the Dallouzou and Gutierrez's concept of the rhizome that is meant to replace the revolutionary ideology based on revolutionary unity. This assumption is that such unity implies totalization of the capture of radical desire. The metaphor of the potato root spreading in innumerable directions is meant to replace the metaphor of a party that with roots in the masses, how we can root ourselves in the matter of a tree if the subterranean reality is so vast. Oh my gosh, we're going to look up this word. Rhizomic, which we're going to look up. We're going to look up rhizomic real quick. Oh, all right. Let me go look at rhizomic. Thank you for reposting. It wouldn't say it for me. So I have a weird definition thing. Here it is. I can't say it. Is an adjective meaning is an adjective meaning of relating to or resembling a rhizomo, which is a plant stem that grows horizontally underground. Oh, okay. So the roots spread out to everybody. The intersectionality spreads out to all the masses. So it is a good concern. It is a good. Okay. That's what they're saying. The root spreads out to all these things. Got it. Amazing. Aisha. Okay. Something rhizomatic is required, capable of spreading along multiple trajectories without any apparent unity. Niger and Hart's notion of the multitude first theorized in Empire is a further development of this concept. Interesting enough, the young Badadu understood the political directions indicated by the theory of the raison, and hence the multitude, and was able to predict the emergence of momentism at the center of capitalism post 1968. Under an anti-organizational pretext, it is not too difficult to see the rejection of the point of view of class. Its theme was the need to add up the revolts, immigrants, women, ecologists, soldiers, prisoners, students, and the gay community, to enumerate and the punctual social forces to infinity, but ostensibly to combat anything resembling the political unification of the people's camp, seized in its antagonistic reflection in its living class being, organizations, and its alleged castrating hierarchies make for broad targets. The one of the multiple of revolts is a question of content, of the politics of the people. Some hide behind the blunders of the form here and there in order to deny the content. Badly camouflaged behind the hatred of militancy was the hatred of class struggle. In effect, if the people do not have their own politics, they will enact the politics of their enemies and political adherers, the void. So they're saying that we have to come up with our own politics. We have to have a proletarian type politics, proletarian type things. Yeah, got to develop our proletarian political views, which we already have. Thus, in focusing on a multiplicity at the expense of unity, and especially at the expense of a primary division between the unified ruling class and the exploited masses, whose unity is necessitated by the unity of the former, and a rectification of the totality of capitalism. The politics of the enemy is accomplished. Decades later, we have seen the result of these politics. The anti-globalization movement shattered against the unity of the state's totality. If Badu has since made a detour from the mindset behind the above quotation, it is only because he has also passed through a period of retreat that has affected his reassertion of the name of communism. Social beings does determine social consciousness to this significant extent, and it is doubtful that he would disagree with this axiom. Axiom means starting point. In any case, the desire to replace necessity with contingency and unity with multiplicity is often based on a misunderstanding of these concepts. There are a common misconception about revolutionary necessity that defines this term accordingly to a crude Enlightenment concept of linear progress. Here, necessity is confused with destiny, as if to argue for scientific necessity of communism is identical to arguing that communism will necessarily happen or that it is preordained by history. Thus, if necessity does indeed mean destiny, then it is easy to understand why contingency is seen as preferable, yeah, same thing. No revolution is fated. The science of history is not the kind of science that automatically determines significant transformations in the mode of production. We cannot claim, however, that communist theory has never dabbled in this simplistic and quasi superstitious historical claim. Even the great communist leaders and theorists have been wont to argue that communism necessity was also a destiny, an unavoidable truth produced by the argument of history. Whether or not these arguments were made for rhetorical reasons, or because those making the arguments were living in a specific historical conjuncture, socialism has already established was already established, and so communism could be seen as being on its way. That makes sense. Ignores the fact that regardless of this dabbling of antiquity, let me look at this word. Yay me. Be right back, everybody. Antiquated. It's antiquated, old fashioned, or outdated. Dabbling in antiquated concepts of unilinear progress. Many of those who have argued for necessity have also been quite honest in their claims that this necessity might never emerge. As noted previously, Engels claims that the scientific strength of communist theory was based on the fact that there was a choice, and a choice is never preordained, between the communist future and the capitalist apocalypse. Rosa Luxemburg defined this choice as one between socialism or barbarism. Marx claimed that revolution was a necessity, and once one speaks of revolution, one must also realize that according to Lenin, revolutions are not spontaneous events, and thus the very fact of organizing a revolution undermines the concept of some unavoidable communist destiny. Mao spoke of even the stage of socialism as being the moment in the revolutionary chain that could be overthrown so that capitalism could be reestablished. To this insight, we can also add the insight of unnumberable Marxist academics who have challenged this fate. Oh my gosh, teleological interpretations of necessity for over a century. While it is true that this unilinear concept of revolution progress has often been part of a communist discourse, it was never properly part of the revolutionary science. Here is too much evidence to the contrary, regardless of the occasional and spurious claims in the polemics of its most faithful adherents. The same adherents were also known to make contrary claims. After all, even if some of their more dogmatic readers and militants focus on these throwaway lines regarding some vague notion of scientific destiny, no critical Marxist devoted to the concept of necessity has truly believed in the inevitability of communism. Only anti-communists and those organizations that made the mistake of accepting this rhetorical discourse believing otherwise. Necessity means only that communism is necessary to solve the problems produced by capitalism. Let me say it again. Necessity means only that communism is necessary to solve the problems produced by capitalism, not that its emergence is disdained. Water is a necessary requirement for human existence, but this does not mean that every human being will have access to water simply because it is a necessity. theorists whose understanding of communism parallels an anti-communist discourse inherited from the Cold War era continue to assert this story about necessities. Oh my gosh. Oh, that's another word I can't say. I'll be right back, everybody. I have another word, everybody. All right, hold on a second. All right, I got the word. It won't let me say it though. Oh well, here it is though. But as soon as I can get the right, as soon as I can do the right things, my brain is just slow. All right, that's the word. The state of quality of being, a synonym. Is it synonym? It's not synonymity. Synonymity? I can't say it. Meaning having the same or a very similar meaning as another word or phrase. For example, the word big and large demonstrates. Okay. Try to say it. Is it synonymity? Synonymity? I can't say the word. It's just hard. All right. Necessities, that word, with outdated concepts and unilinear disdained progress. It is how it is it as it would be ignorant to dismiss modern physics due to the errors of Newtonian paradigms. It is similarly arrogant to dismiss historical materialism due to the past moments of science that, in any case, were not as erroneous as this anti-communist narrative assumes. But such a dismissal became common sense, and by the end of the 20th century, in the imperial core academics and intellectual circles, totality, unity, and necessity were replaced with fragmentation, differences, and contingency. It is in this context that the contemporary academic attempts to reclaim communism have manifested. The rejection of necessity, universality, and continuity on the part of those who speak of hypotheses and horizons only makes sense if seen as a tendency to reclaim totalization in a manner that will appeal to the theoretical traditions that reject this totalization in the first place. They desire to again speak of communism, but are unable to properly engage with that history once dismissed. Oh, you're right there. Once dismissed as a totalitarian. They wish to speak of universality, but end up endorsing particularities in the refusal of examine necessity. What he's saying is that communism is a necessity, not a contingency. It's a necessity to answer all the problems that capitalism brings on. The liberation process, the removal, the emancipation. It's a necessity. The result of this theoretical eclecticism that is only capable of producing sometimes intentionally movementist strategies where it is better to tail a disorganized rebellion without goals, without theoretical organization, without a coherence born from revolutionary necessity, than to coherently address the problems raised by the chain of the world historical revolutions. But anarchists and left liberals can also claim these movementist rebellions, and the former camps has more reasons to adopt this incoherence as an organizational principle. What does a communist analyzes matter when it tells us nothing more significant than what the anarchists have been preaching since Bakunin? How does the academic assessment of communism, incapable of actually stepping outside of the framework of historic history as contingency, contribute anything theoretically significant? At all of this recent and abstract talk of horizons and hypotheses is ultimately silenced by these questions. After the terminologies in these accounts delete the word communism, and we are back to the same anti-communist framework that these new manifestos claim to transcend. So many of these accounts, from Foucault and to the recent academic reclamation of communism, share an implicit disdain for actual revolutionary moments. In the acts of disparaging revolution as either totalizing or failing to represent true liberation, they are forced to dismiss those mass movements that fought to establish a better world. Hence, these academic fads, whatever their strengths are, in the last instance, alien to those people, the wretched of the earth, who are still fighting for the end of capitalism. They're saying that the pools in the global south are the pools of the liberation process, who seek liberation because they're in the forefronts. They're in a sense, they're on the front lines in the globalization of capitalism. They're on the front lines. Collaboration is the next section. We all know what collaboration means. It could be good or bad. It could collaborate with like a Mao's party can collaborate with the Marxist-Leninist party to seek revelations, but to collaborate with like bourgeoisie, that is not good. Collaboration. The dead end of contemporary radical theory cast a shadow over any attempt to reunite anti-capitalist praxis. What is going on? Hello. It is no wonder that academics speak vaguely of horizons and ideals, that intellectual groups invent fanciful terms and imaginary intersections, and that movementism becomes the default practice. We should not be surprised that these new radicalisms that dare to speak the name of communism are always fashionable amongst the academic left. It is quite normal and even encouraged to judge past revolutionary theory boring, predictable, and unworthy of reclamation. When some of us speak of revisionism or opportunism or any of those conceptual names that were understood and reasserted over and over by past revolutionaries, we are charged with orthodoxy compared to those theorists who are constantly inventing new terminologies. Here, what is exciting is often defined by what is the most conceptual nebulous. We appear anachronistic, old-fashioned, out of step with reality. Occasionally, we might be told that we are alienating people with these old concepts, as if the new concepts are any less alienating, and those responsible for such charges forget that just decades ago, we would have been charged with the same alienating practice simply by using that old-fashioned word communism. Let us leave aside for the moment the fact that the mass revolutionary struggles at the peripheries, the global south, since the end of the 1980s to the present draw from supposedly orthodox theoretical traditions that resonate with their understanding of the world. Let's bracket the fact that this charge of being old-fashioned is also a charge leveled at every significant developing world communist struggle to date, some that are happening even now, and pretend, as some radical theorists indeed pretended, that there are no struggles, that matter beyond the centuries of global capitalism. Obviously, we're not discounting attempts to conceive of struggle through new concepts. It is indeed dogmatic to adhere to a purely theoretical constellation and to reject all interventions that challenge static ways of seeing the world, not seizing. At the same time, as discussed, it is equally dogmatic to reject the theoretical traditions that emerge from concrete revolutionary struggles, universalities. This may be the worst form of dogmatism. In fact, because it echoes precisely that we were taught was normative and triumphalist capitalist ideologies. The question we need to ask then is, what clarifies the current historical conjuncture aimed arming the masses with an ideology capable of producing revolution? None of these new manifestos, regardless of how exciting their theoretical approach looks and sounds, is capable of answering these questions and thus providing a new framework for revolution. These new approaches simply reassert the same tired theoretical substitutions that have been proposed since the emergence of scientific socialism. They might sound interesting, but do little beyond the echo of their words. Therefore, could it be that the broad brushstrokes of revolutionary theory that emerge with Marx pass first through Lenin and then through Mao, providing a simpler and clearer explanation of theory and practice than any of these contemporary approaches that attempt to ignore this theoretical development by classifying it as orthodox and dogmatic? Wow. So they're disregarding historical materialism. This is not to say that these broad brushstrokes should ignore and dismiss the concepts of parallel traditions. The question simply has to do with what framework is capable of providing a clearer picture of the reality so as to produce revolutionary action. In these cynical days, all attempts to mobilize the concept of past revolutionary movements are treated as out of step with intellectual fashion, while returning to Marx is no longer unfashionable. Returning to some of those theories that developed Marxism through revolutionary action is in bad taste. Tiquin and the Invisible Committee, for example, associate Marxist-Leninism with fascism. Lazily adopting new wing jingoism and wisdom of Orwell, while celebrating social chauvinists such as Sade and Nietzsche's, Nitzsche. Despite conjuring the name of communism, it is clear that the Invisible Committee sees those who have actually succeeded in making revolution as their enemy. So better to reconstruct Marxism, if not a vague communism only slightly influenced by Marx, but just Marx, accordingly to newer and exciting concepts and fanciful jargon buffet, then draw upon that tired conceptual terrain that was judged as wasteland by the so-called end of history. But why should we settle for intellectual fads? And why should the practice of revolution be confused with the business of academic fashion? Recall that Marx and Engels broke with academic fashion and chose instead to develop and establish their theory within working class struggles. By doing so, they achieved something far more significant than they would have produced had they remained within the ivory tower circles. A theory that resonates with those who possessed the concrete need to overthrow capitalism. And though they might have been deemed unfashionable by the academic standards of the time, they produced the revolutionary legacies that eclipsed whatever legacies has been left by their own academically popular contemporaries, whose names are only now remembered mainly because of Marx and Engels, Feuerbach, Stirner, Breuer, and Dühring. I want to mention one thing. It just came to my mind. Big critique. Not mentioning the Haitian Revolution. I hope he does later, but that's one of my critiques of all of us as Marxist Leninists or Marxist Leninist Maoists, is the fact that the Haitian Revolution was significant, highly significant. So I just want to mention that in case he doesn't mention it at all. I think the Haitian Revolution is very significant. And he also mentions the revolutions that are happening in the peripheries, at least. Periphery is just another word for semi-colony, semi-colonial places. None of this is to say that we should ignore the fact that the word communism has become rather unfashionable at the centers of global capitalism. This is the reason, after all, for all of these new attempts at reclamation. We should know, however, that communism is unfashionable at the imperialist centers due to decades of anti-communist propaganda, combined with the privileged labor aristocracies and the aforementioned, quote, end of history discourse. That's what the capitalists say. Perhaps the desire to rebrand communism with a new language and custom is an attempt to reconstruct its popularity amongst the anti-communists, quote, middle class. At the centers of capitalism, a communism that sounds different, but that is secretly the same as the old communism that we once rejected. Rebranding communism, aside from the commercial logic inherent in such an approach, can only fail if it is aimed solely at the class of people who poses the privilege and wallow in the theoretical obscurantism that is offered as a replacement revolutionary theory. That is, a theory that can only be appreciated by those petite bourgeois intellectuals who believe that conceptual apoquinesis implies radicalism. I'm going to look up this word, everybody. I feel like Sesame Street. I need Sesame Street. I need Sesame Street communism. That's what I want. Sesame Street communism. Won't let me say the name. So let's do this. Let's do effects. All right, so that name is the quality of being unpenetrable to light, meaning the object is not see through. Huh. Oh, don't you dare. All right. Implies radicalism. Here, it is important to note that even the non-academic, quote-unquote, theories reclaim communism that have attained a certain level of popularity amongst the first world activists left, i.e. the invisible committee theory, communistia, edit notes, various autonomous Marxism, etc., are accessible mainly to a privileged population that, even if it prides itself on having never gone to university, is still quite distant from the living experience of the most oppressed and exploited. One of the long-standing problems with our movementist history has been the fact that the mainstream and activist left has largely been composed of people from students or middle class contexts. In any case, if these theoretical substitutions do not resonate with lived conditions of the most exploited and oppressed, but only with those whose class outlook is somewhat elitist, then we must wonder at their revolutionary status. We should not, however, endorse some banal anti-intellectualism and fetishize illiteracy as proletarian. Even the revolutionary theory of yesteryear might at first seem I can't say that word. Apaqua. Apaque. Opaku. I don't know. Now that large proportions of the masses have been socialized after decades of anti-communism to forget the concepts that emerged from their struggles, there is that theory and an accompanying philosophy that, due to the complexity of the terrain, will necessarily require significant education and study to grasp pure mathematics, theoretical physics, philosophy of logic, ontology, but none of these areas of study pretend, at least not regularly, to be theories about making revolution. Hence, we should wonder at those, oh my gosh, I can't say the word, OPAQUE theories. I'm going to figure this out. Hold on, everybody. Let's see if I can get a word to say it. I'll be right back. Oh my gosh, it was opaque the whole time. Um, Opaque. Yeah, it was opaque. Yeah, it was opaque. Oh shit. Gonzo, do you want to come up still? No, okay, good. Opaque theories. So, not transparent, not well seen through. Opaque theories that did not emerge for revolutionary struggles that are imagined by academics, usually disconnected from these struggles, but claim to be the answer to the masses' quandaries about making revolution. That's one of the reasons why I take the Maoist position, because like we got to make organic intellectuals. We got to make it a proletarian society, a full proletarian politics, proletarian everything, like proletarian science, scientific socialism, and entice the masses and actually go and see their needs. That's why like people like the Black Panther Party, before they even did any type of fucking political thing, they went in and see what the masses need first. That's the thing. The point here is not whether or not a theory is difficult to understand. This is a problem that can be solved by making education accessible to the most oppressed and exploited. Rather, whenever we encounter a new theory that speaks of overthrowing the existing social order, the claim to offer the conceptual tools for doing so, we should ask whether these tools are capable of providing a concrete analysis to concrete conditions and reflect the living experience of the world's most exploited and oppressed. You hear that? Gotta go to them. Gotta meet the thing where it's at. That's what we gotta do. Especially with the able-bodied people. You know, able-bodied people got to meet the thing where it's at. Got to observe. Got to record. Got to figure out and then see like what is the contradictions, and within that contradictions, what is the two things that hit against each other? Is it antagonistic? Is it something that needs to be solved? How do you solve it? What are situations to solve the antagonistic contradiction? Can it be put in unity? Does it need to be a qualitative shift to move into something else? That's why it's important to read, to study, but to do more than that. Like the whole thing, like Mal talks about, to read, to study, and then to go into conversations with fellow comrades and to actually eat the piece of cake. To change the cake, you have to eat the cake. Sorry. What we often discover when we ask the above question, though, our theories are primarily speak to the living experience of a very small and particular population based on the centers of capitalism. Academics and intellectuals, activists already converted to socialism. The very lived experience of the chink theoreticians who is attempting, I think it's a chink in the chain, who is attempting to make what was once understood as a privileged and petite bourgeoisie social position into the basis of revolutionary action. Some of these theoreticians and their readers might even pride themselves in being, quote, anti-intellectuals and treating academia with scorn, though the work they produce is still consumed mainly by a population divorced from those who have nothing left to lose but their chains. The most oppressed and exploited masses are reading neither Badiou or Debror, neither Zedekiah nor the Invisible Committee. Most of them are not even reading Marx or Lenin, Luxemburg or Mao. The difference between the former and the latter categories of theory, however, is that the latter emerged from concrete revolutionary history, does speak to the living experience of the masses, whereas the former does not. Theory alienated from practice that contrives to speak in the name of practice should be treated as suspicion. There is at least one answer to this problem, a way to escape the charge of academic, oh my gosh, obscurantism. Let's find out what that means. What is obscurantism? Let's see if I even said it right. Be right back. I said it right, everybody. Look at me. Look at me. I'm growing. Yay, me. Reading is everything. Sorry. Obscurantism. I said it right. The practice of deliberately preventing the facts of fully details of something from becoming known. Ooh, so it's okay. It's in the name. Duh. More than a few of these new theories have claimed from the 1960s to the present that privileged students and academics have become the new revolutionary agents, a new vanguard, but in a spontaneous sense. Middle-class children rioting in the streets of first world privileged students versed in obscurantist jargon smashing Starbucks windows, movementist leaders familiar with the discourse of critical theory. Anything to ignore the fact that these eclectic attempts to reestablish communism are entirely morbid, disconnected from that would make them truly revolutionary, an organized and militant mass movement spearheaded by the gravediggers of capitalism. While it is attempting for attempting while it is attempting for those of us who are petite bourgeoisie intellectuals and students to believe that we will command the revolution, that our class privilege is more of an asset than an inhibition. We need to recognize this empty fantasy for what it is. Our class has never led revolutionary movements and has often ended up hampering these movements. The theory we occasionally invent to justify our revolutionary status might be an attempt to maintain our privilege in the movement that should be aimed at ending privilege altogether. Here is a terrible notion. So basically, we got to proletarianize even the intellectuals that are in the high horse in the high towers. Got to proletarianize. And the left comes with say to communize. Here is a terrible notion, one that we avoid whenever we embrace those theories that justify our class privilege. We will more than likely be sent down to the countryside whenever this figurative, quote, countryside happens to be. We too will have to be re-educated. Ooh, I love that. Most of us are terrified by those possibilities, disgusted by the necessity of rectification, of being dragged down. He's calling out the intellectuals and even himself. He's self-criticizing himself. self-criticizing himself. We need to recognize, however, the being dragged down to the level of the masses as is at the same time a dragging up of the masses to the level that under the current state of affairs, only some are privileged enough to occupy. So what he's saying is, as you get dragged down, the intellectuals get dragged down to the masses and get re-educated, because they'll be re-educated by the masses, they meet each other at a center point, and they become even with each other. So it's like a mass line. I don't know. Maybe I'm going too far with the mass line. To reject the radical movement and equalization, dragged up by the masses under the current state of affairs, and some are privileged enough to occupy. To reject this radical moment of equalization is to ratify class to given our opportunities to class to believe that even after a revolution, we are superior to those who are not given our opportunities. To act as if the necessity of revolutionary leveling is akin to oppression, just as Dante descended into hell in order to climb to heaven, recognized in his descent that hell was the world in reverse. Communism can only be achieved through a painful, chaotic descent of those who have the most to lose. A decent parallel by the ascent of that class that had nothing to lose but its chains. Calling on the fucking intellectuals to do fucking class self-unalivement. It is interesting to note that the most prevalent left-wing anti-intellectualism, where critical literacy itself is treated as bourgeoisie, generally maintain the self-elitism. By placing value on some imagined authentic proletarian intelligence and culture. It argues against the necessity of mass education and mass re-education. This anti-intellectual tendency implicitly assumes that the dragging up is elitist because it is secretly fearful of being dragged down. The proletarian must stay true to understanding as beautiful in its ignorancy of anything but its spontaneous revolutionary values. The intellectual division of labor remains cloaked by a clumsy attempt to argue that some illiterate, but authentic, quote, working class culture, end quote, as if the proletarian possesses a hegemonious culture, should be preserved. This class culturalism tends to be a prominent but by those people who already possess intellectual privilege. This politics is an attempt to replace theories of declassing with a quasi-theory of patronization. Using the big words, though. I like this. This is good. Instead of tendering new theories, new ways of packaging communism, we need to confront our historical inability to address the anti-communist ideology that has become prevalent in the centers of capitalism. We collaborate with our silence. We accepted the bourgeois discourse of failure. We refuse to organize and share our education, and we head within the abyss of academic privilege, withdrawn from struggle, allowing communism to become an unfashionable term. We collaborated and still collaborate with every lie promoted about the state, the late Soviet Union, or the pre-Deng communist China, and their supposed crimes against humanity, falsely compared to fascism due to the discourse of, quote, totalitarianism, end quote, that we have also, out of fear of ignorance, supported. He's calling out all the fucking intellectuals. Love it. We collaborated when we chose to tail rebellions. Remember, tailism is dragging your feet, trying to stagnate and stifle development, refusing to organize them into anything militantly coherent out of the fear that the masses were not ready for revolutions. The masses are the ones that are ready for revolution. What are you talking about? We collaborate when we refuse to recognize the ongoing communist people's war at the peripheries of global capitalism and refuse to transpose this experience into our own concrete circumstances. We collaborate when we dismiss the demands of necessity, embrace some banal notion of contingency, and refuse to speak of communism as anything other than an abstract ideal based. I love that. I like that section. That section was fucking amazing. So contingency, throw it away. Necessity is needed. Communism is a necessity to solve the problems and contradictions of capitalism for the masses. It's a necessity, not a contingency. It is a necessity that is born out of mass mobilization, mass education, and all those things. It is born by the masses. Like I said, even as a Maoist, my job is, as a Marxist too, to observe what is right and what is the correct line to seek the liberation process from capitalism by the masses of workers. So even as a Maoist, I have to observe the correct line that will be drawn from the masses to take on. Language and idealism. Ooh, this might be a hard one for me. Academic collaboration reaches its nadir. Ooh, that's a weird word. It's an easy word. I'm going to look it up. I was right the first time. Nadir. Here we go. Effects. Is the lowest point in the fortunes of a person's or organization. It's got to be that one. I like this communist necessity. So I'll reread it again. Academic collaboration reaches its nadir when it sinks into a vague language idealism. Here is where the concept of communism is misunderstood as a platonic form. Here is where the concrete politics of this concept are reduced to a language game, and necessity of revolution is abandoned. Remember, necessity is the thing. Necessity. Exactly, Doodley. Exactly, because we're at the end of the day, we are scientific revolutionaries. We are scientific socialists. We are materialists. We are dialectic materialists. And we are also materialist dialectics. Because we implement things based on the material conditions. When some theorists claim that communism is a notion that can be projected into a distant past, is an idea, a hypothesis that was always present when the revolutionary articulation of this name that was first provided by Marx and Engels, and thus meant something different from the name that was used. If it was used, a prior epoch is dismissed. Names are conflated with concepts, and a concept that could only emerge at the end of the 19th century, regardless of the etymological cipher used to earmark this concept, is suddenly imagined to have existed prior to the only moment in which it could have emerged. The word communism is thus dissected according to the vague notions, dislocated from what it meant when it was used by Marx and Engels, and can be misunderstood as a transhistorical and a priori. There were always movements that believed in community and holding property in common. Why not pretend that the crude and the utopian socialism of the earlier Christians, who conceptually the same as scientific socialism expounded by Marx and Engels? The answer should be evident. though its simplicity might appear at first glance to be too vulgar of a to accept to accepted to be accepted. Sorry, Marx and Engels went to great lengths to demonstrate the difference of their socialism from the utopian socialism and their time, and thus named in as communists so as to not simply use the word socialist that was also being used by the utopians. As such, we are not at all interested in using the word as it has been used in the past, regardless of the vague conceptual similarities the name invokes. And yet, academic collaborators have constantly obsessed over a name, confusing the moment of naming with the moment of conceptualization. Jean-Luc Nancy's essay, Communism, the Word, is, oh my gosh, paradigmatic. What is paradigmatic? Let's find out what paradigmatic is. Not philosophers. Come on. There it goes. I'll be right back. Hey, comrade. No worries. Said it right. Look at me. Yay, me. Saying things right. So, paradigmatic is serving as a typical example for something. I denote a relationship between a linguistic. Let me see here. It might be linguistic. Of a denoting of a relationship between a set of linguistics items in a form mutual. If I can move it. Mutually exclusive choices and particular syntactic roles. I think it's number 2. Seems like it'd be number 2. Oops. Let me get back to my thing. I have to do a picture every day. Every day. To do a new picture every day. All right. Paradigmatic of this language idealism. Here is an instance where a philosopher uses some vague notion of etymological destiny to confuse names with concepts. Communism as a word is traced back to the 11th and 14th century. Some similarities between the modern conception and the nebulous pre-modern concept are established. Quote, people having a common and, quote, common property, and ultimately, quote, being in common. And I would also mention, since I don't think he's going to mention, is indigenous communities and societies. And then the modern revolutionary notions is dismissed because of the inability to adhere to the name's supposed etymological roots and in the end result. Communism therefore means a common condition of all the singularities of subjects, that is, of all the exceptions, all the uncommon points whose network makes a world. It does not belong to a political. A vague and nebulous definition designed to exclude the revolutionary definitions based on an etymological game that takes the Latin communitas, it's in Spanish, Latin, I mean, as its point of departure, when meaning is located in etymologically any conceptualization of the word that does not strictly cohere to its etymological origins is treated as erroneous. But Marx and Engels did not employ the name communism because they sought fidelity with the esoteric and etymological meaning. It was simply one word, chosen amongst many to define the scientific concepts that during their time was entirely new and in search of a name. they could have used other words if they had to choose, and only used the word communism because it appeared to represent what they meant. And what they meant was a concept, not simply a name, but a concept to which this name is now irrevocably attached. As Engels wrote in 1885, communism among the French and German, Chartism among the English, not now no longer appear as something accidental, which could just as well not have occurred. These movements now presented themselves as a movement of a modern oppressed class, the proletariat, as the more or less developed forms of its historical necessary struggle against the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, as forms of the class struggle, but distinguished from all earlier class struggles by this one thing, that the present day oppressed class, the proletariat, cannot achieve its emancipation without the same time emancipating society as a whole from division into classes, and therefore from class struggles. And communism now no longer meant the concoction by means of imagination of an ideal society as perfect as possible, but insight into the nature, the condition, and the consequent general aims of the struggle waged by the proletariat. To speak of some inner communist truth based on the recourse to language games to ultimately disingenuous. It tells us nothing of the conceptual terrain opened by those theorists who were arguing for the necessity of revolutionary science. Although one is always welcome to embrace the meaning of names before the emergence of a coherent concept, this course of an internal idea hypothesized or etymological essence is an abandonment of history. For if etymology determines conceptual destinies, then every science is nonsensical. Modern particle physics, after all, utilizes the word atom, and only the anti-scientific arrogant who dare to argue that today's physicists are committed a grave error by failing to adhere to the word's etymological roots, to suggest that the modern scientists remain faithful to the original accent of Hellenic conceptualization of the name atom, atom, in order to properly understand their science is laughable at best. At worst, it is reactionary. Words and language. I'm going to check something real quick, everybody. 58. Everybody, remember 58. Okay, you know what? We're good. All right, so we're coming to a close. We're probably in a little bit earlier. All right. So the reason why they're reactionary is because they're saying that, like, anybody that says, oh, it's not an atom, what are you talking about? Blah, 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 blah. We're going to change it. It's a reactionary response. You know? That's what I'm getting. Words in any language are mediated by the historical moment. Words are not substances. They do not possess intrinsic essences. Concepts stand over and above words, though they often use specific names that communicate some sort of vague meaning to the concepts, such as meaning, though is demonstrated by the succession of a pastoral words designed to further demarcate a concept. We are indeed limited by our language, but this language is not in of itself a destiny. Yeah. Etymological analysis is useful to explain a given word's origin, but it does not decide conceptual meaning. As, here we go. Wittgenstein once claimed, quote, "The meaning of a word is its use in language. And since Marxists believe that a given language is in a last stance the product of concrete history, and that language is always mediated by social and historical circumstances, we must go further and claim that the meaning of a word is determined by a concrete social process." Okay. After all, this attempt to locate the meaning of the word in its historical point of origin immediately becomes nonsensical and even Eurocentric. Ooh. Once we take into account communities that do not share the same grammatical history, communists in India, Nepal, and Afghanistan, for example, do not have an etymological concept of communeta. Communetes. It's the Latin word for communism. A Latin word from which it derives the modern concept of communism that, for them, is precisely the concept originally theorized by Marx and Engels. Does this mean that they do not properly understand this concept because it belongs in those language communities who share Latin and Greek as their grammatical roots? Obviously not. Even worse, does this mean that they are importing a concept that, due to the Latin origins of its name, is itself a Eurocentric composition of their own struggles? Clearly, Badiou's form of language idealism would deny this etymological tendency, since quite obviously we can find utopian, quote, communist practices in these non-European spaces as well. Contrary to Badiou's assumption, though, these earlier practices, like those elsewhere, were not at all the same practices as the clear-cut theoretical and scientific concept at the end of the 19th century. Just as one cannot project capitalism back into the ancient world, no one can also not project communism into the pre-capitalist past. Moving from the heights of academia to the still alienated theory of popular leftist intellectuals, we find the same language idealism amongst the communism and the invisible committee, theory communistia, in notes and others. The movementist activist circles that are interested again in the name of communism are properly not reading Nancy, but they are gravitating to these communization theories, or at least the most popular expression of autonomism. And in doing so, they are introducing to a concept of communism that is primarily based on its etymological roots: community, reclaiming the commons, and anything that can divorce the word from how it developed through the most revolutionary moment of the 20th century. Any reclamation of the word communism then cannot be reclamation that relies only on this amorphous academic exercise which attempts to locate meaning outside the concrete historical practices and instead obsesses over names and vague utopian articulations that preceded the most coherent and contemporary variant of the concept. Concepts are not transhistorical, but are produced by humans living in real social and historical circumstances. We should ask what practices this type of language idealism necessitates. Since such theories reject the concrete in favor of nebulous proclamations, they cannot produce a concretely revolutionary project. Their radicalism becomes little more than a theoretical gesture. Chapter 3, New Returns, and we'll stop here for the day. Stop here. I don't think I can highlight. Can I circle? It won't let me circle. All right. And it was good. I got some of it. And I'm talking about the root word and everything, and like changing it up, like, And in another sense, he's saying that does it matter the word? I mean, do they know what they're doing? And then he says that that word means differently and what they're doing. Yeah, it's just different language, different Lewin. I can't say it. Lewins. I can't say it. Lewin. I can't say it. I can't say it. I tried. But I loved it. I loved the other part where he's calling out the intellectuals that they have to be brought down to the most exploited and most oppressed to have understanding.
Yes.
I love that part. As
Yeah,
we raise
because
the masses, we lower them down and they meet each other. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, you're good. You're good. I was just gonna uh I'm gonna say that, yeah, Abel's think that they're the norm. Us white people think we're the norm. Men think we're the norm. Like all class structures, uh, all class structures need to be dealt with,
Mm-hmm.
and those who are privileged inside those class structures need to be brought down a peg.
Yeah, and he also called out, also, he said that intersectionality needs to be a part of this because those different social oppressions are very prevalent and material. You know what I mean? So I like that he called it out because it is what we deal with. You know, as the masses, as proletarians, as lumpen proletarians. What's up, Joe?
Uh, I was going to come up to tell you the question, but you answered it on my way up, so now I'm just here. Tell you,
You
great
did.
review. It was wonderful.
Yeah, yeah.
uh,
I love this. I think I like. I gotta look at his name. I like this author. I think I like this author. J. Malford Paul. I think he's pretty good. You know, I think he called because he himself he called himself out as an intellectual too, and I love that. He gave himself a self criticism on what he needs to do too, and I like that.
Yeah, that's
yeah,
awesome.
and I like how he mentioned language as well.
Yeah, how
Because
languages are different. Yeah, exactly.
yeah, um, how they're shaped by social conditions and that, um, and their meaning, and yeah, I
Hmm.
and yeah, I I just yeah, I'm glad that that was mentioned.
Yeah, and I like how he says that it's a necessity, not a prophecy. Communism is not a prophecy; it's a necessity. I loved how he distinguished between the two, and how it gets muddled up if we think it's a prophecy as if it's supposed to come. It's something to be made. It's something to solve the current conditions. I like that part. That helps me bring
Yeah,
it into reality. And even like you say, me and Dooley, you and me agree. Even as a Maoist, I need to observe what might rupture out of the political terrain that is correct, right? It might not be Maoism here in the United States, you know?
hmm
So,
yeah,
and he still does
and
that. Even he's a Maoist and he's like, he still recognizes that.
yeah, and yeah, that that's why it is important to try and um, make sure that you aren't um, you aren't forcing the masses to think one way. You analyze what motivates them, and you put that into play, and then you let the masses decide, and you are being one with the masses, not
Immersed with the masses, yes. Instead of
Right,
yeah,
which is
tailing,
mass line theory, right?
yep, instead of tailing,
yeah,
instead of commanding, we're in the middle. Because the masses are the ones that create the history, create everything that society needs. And they're being exploited. So they create their, again, like he said, their proletarian politics, if we should call that. the proletarian theories and stuff like that that gives them the emancipation from capitalism. So, yeah. All right. Does anybody else have anything else before I close it out? Everybody enjoying this book so far?
I am.
What? Go ahead, Joe.
I said I don't have anything else to say, and I am quite enjoying this book.
What about you, Dooley? You enjoying the book? Anything you have to say?
Yeah. I think that the author is aware of their faults and is trying to give self-criticism, and I like that.
Yeah, I like that too. All right, well, I am going to shut her down, and I will go in a few more. I hope everybody enjoys their evening. Okay.